Welcome to part 3 of Contradictions within Mormon Theology. And this one has to do with the structure of the Mormon Church, which they would claim is a reason why the Mormon Church must be true. But their structure itself self-refutes it. Let's get into it. So a claim I come across a lot when I'm talking with Mormons is the claim that the church now, if it's going to be the church of Jesus Christ, needs to be the same structure that Jesus Christ set up in the Middle East, in Israel, before he left and ascended into heaven. But if that's true, I would ultimately say that despite what LDS wants to proclaim, it actually isn't fitting that. And let me explain why. If we take a look here, this is the way that the LDS church structure works. And if we kind of explain the different ways that they're looking at it, first they believe that they must have a living prophet. Up here you have a prophet of God who is seen as the continuation of the prophets, both of the Old Testament and kind of as that role similar to the Pope that they believe is actually established under, I would think, Peter. And that structure has to then continue on. There must be a living prophet. That God has always functioned with using living prophets in the past. There's no reason that he wouldn't have living prophets in the future or now, which I still haven't had a good answer for why that fits in line with Hebrews 1, that it says, in times past, God spoke to us through the prophets, but now he has sent us his son. But let's just ignore that for now. The other thing is, it's vital and important to LDS, and in this, I before have been doing reasons why Mormonism altogether doesn't make sense. This is getting into more details specifically within the LDS church, and we're looking at the details there, but other Mormon sects, this probably has a similar application. But it's vital and important to LDS that God still has prophets today. They also then claim that it's biblical structure for the church to have 12 disciples and 3 in the roles of Peter, James, and John. Most of us, if you know your Bible well enough, that it seems like Jesus, within the disciples himself, his 12 disciples, he seems to have 3 that were his really right-hand guys. The guys that he even was more intimate with, that he was at the Mount of Transfiguration, and they saw Elijah and Moses with him. Well, LDS take that to mean that there's actually 3 at the top. Peter, James, and John. This is the first presidency, so the president, aka the living prophet today, and his 2 counselors. But there's a problem with this theory. When you think about it, Peter, James, and John were not separate and apart from the disciples, the 12 disciples themselves. They were distinguished among the 12 disciples. So Peter, James, and John are not separate from the 12. They are part of the number that makes the 12 disciples. So if the argument that LDS are making is that the church today needs to have 12 disciples, well, you don't have 12 disciples. If your first presidency, these guys up at the top, are in the roles of Peter, James, and John, then they are actually part of those disciples according to the way the biblical structure would have made the government. Which means Peter, James, and John are part of the 12, which means we should move them down here, which means you have 15 apostles. But wait, it gets better. LDS theology also believes that John and 3 other former apostles are still around. Now let me explain. If you're not familiar, the belief is that when Peter at one point asks what's going to happen to John, and Jesus replies to him saying, "What is it of you? What happens to John? Only worry about yourself." They take that to mean what Jesus is implying is John's not going to die. And in fact, they have, I think, in other parts of the scriptures, that John asks that he can remain around to continue the work of the church until Christ returns. So John isn't dead. He's still alive. He's still doing the ministry and the work of the church today. But that gets even more interesting, because then the belief is, with all the other beliefs of Mormonism, that Jesus didn't just set his first 12 apostles here in Israel, or there in Israel, but he actually had 12 more here in the United States, what is now the United States, or what is now South America, depending on what theory you follow. And those guys, 3 of them also asked the same thing that John did. And they are also still around proclaiming the gospel, which means that if the church exists now with its first presidency, which would be 3 more guys added to the 12 disciples, and you have John and these 3 Nephites who are also still around as apostles helping to proclaim the church and bring it along, then you actually have 4 more. So this ruins your whole theology regarding the idea that, well, you have to have a church that has 12 disciples because that's the way Jesus set it up. Because if that's what you need to have, well, then LDS have not 12 disciples, but 19. So Mormons, if you're out there, specifically LDS, but if you're a Mormon and this still applies to you, you see the ways that your own church doesn't really just have 12 disciples, I have to ask, how do you respond to this? Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please pass it on to others. Check out my blog for some other content that I don't have on my YouTube channel, as well as check out my other social media. And if you're enjoying this enough, even think about supporting this financially. You can do that through Ratio Christi. I have a link below.